A huge explosion near Damascus International Airport in Syria. State media says Israel is responsible. Hello, I'm Rochelle Carey. This is Aljazeera live from Doha. Also coming up,
we want to bring Kim Jong-un to his senses, not to his knees.
Vowing all options are possible, the U.S. says it will force North Korea back to nuclear talks. Quitting the Organization of American States, Venezuela accuses its neighbors of trying to topple President Nicolas Maduro. And NASA's Cassini spacecraft begins its historic dive between Saturn and its rings. Now comes a nail-biting wait. There's been a huge explosion near Damascus International Airport, which Syrian state TV has just said was the result of Israeli airstrikes. The airport's about 25 kilometers from the center of the Syrian capital. Earlier, Israel's intelligence minister said that the strike is consistent with Israeli policy, but didn't confirm his country's involvement. This video was posted on social media by an activist group in Ghouta. They say that it shows the explosion and several large fires that started afterwards. More on this now from Imtiaz Tayeb, who's live for us in the Lebanese capital, Beirut. So, Imtiaz, Hezbollah was quick to accuse Israel. Syrian state TV is now saying that Israel's responsible. Israel is not denying it either.
No, certainly not. In fact, just around an hour ago, Israel's Intelligence Affairs Minister, Yisrael Katz, was speaking to Israeli army media saying, and I quote, this strike was entirely consistent with our policy to prevent the transfer of weapons to Hezbollah. However, Katz stopped short of confirming that Israel was behind this strike. But Rochelle, in the last sort of week or so, we had a very rare admission from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that his military has carried out several strikes, if you will, against what they described as weapons shipments to Hezbollah. Hezbollah, of course, is the Lebanese movement which is heavily involved in the fighting in Syria. It is supported by Iran. It supports the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad in the many battles raging across Syria. But again, a longtime enemy of Israel. And Israel has, although it never said explicitly up until a week ago that it carries out these strikes, here we are now seeing a major one at the Damascus airport. We understand that, at least according to intelligence officials, that this was a weapons cache from Iran in this airport area, and that could perhaps explain why this strike was felt so intensely around the area. But again, we aren't hearing of any casualties whatsoever. And the Syrian military confirming that Israeli strikes were carried out at this airport, but stopping short of saying just what exactly was targeted.
So, Imtiaz, what does this mean for the war in Syria? What does this say about the war in Syria?
Well, I think more than anything, Rochelle, it really just underscores how this multi-sided conflict in which there are so many groups on the ground and so many international interests being played out, that this is just another extension of that. Israel and Hezbollah, longtime foes who have been fighting each other for decades now, well, that fight is in the Syrian battlefield as well. But given the military might of Israel and the increasing might of Hezbollah, we're seeing it manifest itself in very different ways. Of course, this strike early this morning at the Damascus airport, a very powerful explosion that, again, as we've been saying, was felt from many, many miles away. But again, we've also seen other areas targeted. In fact, on Friday last week, Israel, for the first time, used its Arrow missile defense system. This is a missile defense system which essentially knocked down Syrian surface-to-air missiles after after Israel carried out a strike inside the Quneitra province, which is an area which borders the occupied Golan Heights, and that is why the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had to acknowledge that Israel does carry out these strikes. So, as we've been saying, what it really just says and what it really just underscores is that Syria's multi-sided war is also a battlefield that involves Israel and Hezbollah, two longtime foes.
Imtiaz Tayeb live in Beirut. Imtiaz, thank you. The Trump administration has signaled that it's willing to try all non-military options to deal with North Korea's growing nuclear and missile threat. The hint at further sanctions followed a special briefing for the entire U.S. Senate. Military strikes, though, are still on the table, as White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett reports.
No ordinary day on Capitol Hill, as U.S. senators, nearly all 100 of them, boarded buses and traveled down Pennsylvania Avenue to the grounds of the White House. Inside the old executive office building adjacent to the White House, senators were briefed by the state and defense secretaries, the chair of the Joint Chiefs, and the director of national intelligence on the options being considered to deal with what they say is the escalating threat by North Korea.
I don't think we ought to be at the table talking with them. I think they need to take concrete steps that show that they've reduced a currently very aggressive posture.
North Korea is the most dangerous spot on the planet right now. And Kim Jong-un is a dangerous and wildly unpredictable dictator who unfortunately has a significant arsenal of nuclear weapons.
The White House says the president's approach aims to pressure North Korea into dismantling its nuclear program by tightening economic sanctions and pursuing diplomatic measures with U.S. allies. But military options are also being prepared. On Wednesday, the head of the U.S. Pacific Command told members of Congress the U.S. would continue to debut their best military systems in South Korea.
That's why the ROK-U.S. alliance decided last July to deploy THAAD. That's a Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, which will be operational in the coming days and able to better defend South Korea against the growing North Korea threat.
But they are preparations anti-war activists protesting outside the White House say are unwelcome.
Donald Trump has pulled the U.S. senators, all 100 of them from both parties, together here at the White House to act as props, really stage-managed props for his escalating threats against North Korea. We're here to say to the President and to the Congress, the last thing the American people want is another war.
Still, the White House says it's focused on making the necessary military preparations, but remaining hopeful diplomacy will prevail. Kimberly Halkett, Aljazeera, Washington.
And Wayne Hay is in Seoul to tell us how the South Koreans are reacting to these developments in Washington.
Not surprisingly, there is a lot of support from within the South Korean government for the stance taken by the United States following that Senate briefing in Washington on the situation in North Korea. We've heard from the South Korean Foreign Ministry making a regular media briefing, but in that briefing it said that the steps taken by the United States so far in dealing with Pyongyang are unprecedented in their strength. So it seems that increasingly the governments in the United States, South Korea and Japan, those three allies, are talking more about things like dialogue and diplomacy and a little bit less about things like military options still being on the table, although clearly they still are. But it does bring up the question where to next, and the South Korean government has said that the door will be open to talks with Pyongyang if the regime in North Korea commits to denuclearization and sincere change first. But the government here in Seoul says that they want to see concrete actions first and not just words if that door is to open. Clearly, it's a big if because there is no sign that the regime in North Korea is going to give up its nuclear ambitions.
And we're going to Beijing now, where anger is growing over the THAAD missile system. China correspondent Adrian Brown is there. So what are they saying in China, and who are they saying it to, a domestic or an international audience, Adrian?
Yes, there was an interesting announcement this afternoon here in Beijing from China's Foreign Ministry and also from the Defense Ministry, both departments confirming that China is going to hold war games, we don't know when, where there'll be live fire exercises and also a number of new weapons are going to be tested. Now, at the regular daily Foreign Ministry briefing a short time ago, the Foreign Ministry spokesman said that THAAD was destroying regional security and stability. So fairly strong language coming from China today. Slightly more unsettling, though, are pictures that are now appearing on a number of Chinese news websites showing the Dongfeng 31 long-range missile. This is a missile that has the capability of reaching a distance of 11,000 kilometers, so potentially reaching the United States. And this picture of this missile is being shown in the context of the ongoing debate about China's opposition to THAAD. And what China's message appears to be is this: we all have the power to destroy one another, but wouldn't it be better if we just sat down and talked instead?
So this crisis right now, is this as much about China as it is about North Korea?
Well, you know, I think it is. You know, when it comes to China's opposition to this anti-missile defense system that's possibly going to be operational in South Korea in the next few months, China believes that this THAAD system is aimed not just at containing North Korea, but also at containing China, because China says it has a very powerful radar that can reach deep into Chinese territory, perhaps a distance of up to 2,000 kilometers. So China believes that the arguments that are being put forward by the United States about why THAAD is needed to shoot down potentially North Korean missiles is a bogus argument. Also today, China is digesting the news that the United States is going to toughen sanctions against North Korea. And in the small print of that announcement by the Trump administration is the fact that the United States may well go after non-Chinese citizens as well as third countries. For third countries, read China. So potentially the United States may now go after, you know, Chinese banks, trading companies that enable business with North Korea. And the question is whether Xi Jinping has signed off on that.
Okay, Adrian Brown, live for us in Beijing. Thank you, Adrian. 9 more pro-independence protesters have been arrested in Hong Kong. This is part of a widening crackdown by police over an anti-China rally in November. The protests were sparked by Beijing's decision to intervene in a row over blocking 2 leading pro-independence political figures from their positions in parliament. The 2 were charged with illegal assembly on Wednesday. Still ahead in the half hour, Chad's former president to learn if his war crimes conviction will be overturned. Also, warnings that poverty and drought are threatening a 22-year peace in Niger.
Hello, the tropical showers throughout Malaysia and Indonesia are getting big again, maybe rather more frequent, though there are still big areas where it stays dry. Java looks fairly dry, for example. But Borneo has been seeing a fair few, and it's true further west. Singapore, Kuala Lumpur have both been reporting pretty good downpours, and the showers are developing a bit further north through Thailand into southern Vietnam and bits of Cambodia and Laos and the southern Philippines, and that'll carry on for the next couple of days. But the most active weather actually is just south of the equator and touching the north of Australia. It's a tropical low, tropical cyclone. It's not going to develop into very much wind-wise, but it's already dropping a fairly regular daily dose of about 100 millimetres just north of Darwin. This is the second day in a row where this area has been soaking wet. Now, the rest of the continent is relatively free of cloud. We've seen cold fronts go through in the south in particular, and Victoria's suffering the cold. That's true of South Australia. So in Adelaide and in Melbourne, you're in the high teens, which is a bit low for this time of year, and that's stretched up to Sydney. Even Brisbane's not as good as it could be, but on a par with Perth. So I have to say, I think Perth's weather's probably looking better if you're there, warm and without the breeze or much cloud. It doesn't get much better in Melbourne, only 17 degrees by day and pretty cold at night.
The U.S. faces a seismic shift in science and environmental policy.
We now find ourselves in one of the most intimidating and frightening environments.
Evidence is seen to be optional.
Fault Lines investigates what the Trump administration will mean for the future of the planet.
you're making a choice, and the choice that you're making is for there to be less protections.
Fault lines, state of denial on Aljazeera.
You're watching Al Jazeera. Let's take a look at the top stories this hour. There has been a huge explosion near Damascus International Airport in Syria. Syrian state TV says it was an Israeli airstrike. Israel's government has not confirmed that. Also in Syria, activists say at least 10 people have been killed by a government airstrike at a makeshift refugee camp. And the White House has signaled it is willing to try all non-military options, but isn't ruling out force to rein in North Korea's nuclear and missile program. A former president of Chad is about to find out whether his appeal against a war crime conviction has been successful or not. Hissène Habré was sentenced to life in prison for crimes against humanity. They included torture, rape, and summary execution when he was leader in the 1980s. If his appeal is rejected, Habré will serve his sentence in Senegal or another African Union country. Al Jazeera's Colin Baker is in Dakar. So, Colin, could the court actually overturn this conviction?
Well, we don't know. It seems unlikely. This is a case that was 2 years in the running, but 27 years in the making. This appeal has really been based on technicalities. The legal team representing Hissène Habré never actually had any contact with Hissène Habré. The former president of Chad rejected his own legal team 2 years ago. He probably won't even be in court today to witness this last stage of the process. So unlikely that their decision for life imprisonment will be appealed, but it is very important for both the victims, for the lawyers, and for international observers that the due process is followed to the letter of the law. This is a special court, and they would like to see it legitimized in the eyes of the international community.
Let's talk a little bit more about the victims. Where do things stand for them? Is it finally over?
Well, these victims, again, the ones who've seen this case through, have been doing so for over a generation in time. Now, they're still seeking reparations. They've asked for $90 million thereabouts in financial reparations, and they're asking this appeals court to establish a trust fund in order to handle that money. The problem is that so far the court has only been able to find about $500,000 in assets owned by the former president of Chad. So they probably have quite a long way to go. In addition, they're becoming high-demand speakers, and the lawyers certainly are being pulled aside at legal conferences around the world, asked how did they make this happen? How did this particular case actually get from its beginning in 1990 to today with the former president behind bars? And so likely these victims will be called upon at international conferences to share their experience.
All right, Colin Baker live for us in Dakar. Colin, thank you. A hepatitis epidemic has killed 25 pregnant women in a refugee camp in Niger. Doctors Without Borders blames contaminated water for the hepatitis E outbreak in the Diffa region. It's home to many Nigerians who fled across the border to escape Boko Haram.
A major issue in the region at the moment is in relation to health. On the 14th of April, the Minister of Health declared an epidemic of hepatitis E in the region. There have been over 100 cases declared and unfortunately over 25 deaths. So we're working very closely with the government, with the World Health Organization and partners to put in place activities in terms of WASH to ensure access to clean drinking water and medication for health centres, and to communicate with the population in terms of avoiding the disease prevention.
Niger's Tuareg community has been celebrating 20 years of peace with the government. The tribal leaders warn that poverty, drought, and armed groups have to be dealt with to make sure that stability lasts. Mohammed Val reports.
A giant sword is pointed downward deep in the sand. The symbolism in the town of Chintabaradan is extremely powerful in Tuareg culture. It signals the war is over. It's been 22 years since the Tuareg of Niger signed a final peace accord with the government following years of bloodshed. The date of the signing has been commemorated ever since. by the Tuareg community and the government. Hundreds of tribal leaders converged to discuss ways to make the most of the benefits of peace.
We have to congratulate ourselves over the Niger Peace Accord, honestly. Its results are here. If that accord was not good, or if it hasn't been implemented, we'd have seen the consequences of that already.
Niger's sizable Tuareg community is represented strongly in the government, but the majority of their people still live in rural areas and observe an age-old tribal way of life. Their nomadic lifestyle made them vulnerable to a severe drought that struck the Sahel for decades.
Since the peace agreement, we enjoy total peace with the government, but our people are still on the move in the countryside due to drought. They need to settle down and find jobs because they have lost their livestock. Some of them went to other countries. The government hasn't done enough to accommodate them at home. Even international relief doesn't come to this area.
Signs of desperation can be seen around the town where the festival was held. Peace has not brought prosperity. Many Tuareg need education and employment. In the last few years, another major problem compounded the hardships and dangers facing this community. Hundreds of young Tuareg joined armed groups such as Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram. Fighters crossing from Nigeria have repeatedly attacked Niger. Its normally moderate Muslim society needed guidance. That task has been taken up by local imams such as Abdullah Musa. He tours the region with other imams to provide relief to the needy and to warn against religion being used to instigate violence.
Here in Niger, we feel caught between Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda, so as religious leaders, we're using the mosques to teach people the right form of Islam. Our purpose is to help them stay away from extremism.
Abdullah is old enough to remember the long years of drought and rebellion before 1995. Now he feels peace in Niger is threatened by the lack of education and economic development. Mohammed Val, Aljazeera.
Venezuela has confirmed it will withdraw from the Organization of American States, accusing it of trying to topple President Nicolas Maduro. Anti-government demonstrations in the capital, Caracas, are entering their fourth week and continue to descend into violence. More now from Teresa Bo.
Every day, members of the opposition in Venezuela have a new objective. They want to continue pressuring the government of Nicolás Maduro. On Wednesday, protesters in San Cristóbal in the state of Táchira headed to the National Electoral Council to demand the government calls for elections.
We want to tell the police that defending a corrupt government that doesn't allow their own mothers, brothers, and grandmothers to get medicine. We are telling you to let us pass because the Electoral Council belongs to the people and not to those in the presidential palace, who are growing richer every day.
In the capital, Caracas, thousands of protesters tried to make it to the Ombudsman office, but they met fierce resistance from the Bolivarian National Guard. One person was killed when hit with a tear gas canister. Protests are happening almost every day since the Supreme Court tried to strip Congress of its legislative powers.
Evidently, the idea is that the Ombudsman evaluates the ruling of the magistrates who carried out the coup d'etat to reinstate the constitution, reinstate democracy so that there is balance, independence and a separation of public powers.
People say they're tired of the severe economic crisis. Millions are struggling with lack of food and shortages of essential medicines.
We're just a few meters away from the border, and these shops have flourished. They're basically selling products to Venezuelan people. They're coming here to buy some flour, rice, oil, and diapers. They say those are the things that they cannot find or simply cannot afford in Venezuela.
In Washington, the Organization of American States called for a foreign affairs ministers meeting to discuss how best to deal with the crisis. But Caracas says the meeting is part of a Washington-led campaign against the government and has announced it will begin the 24-month process required to leave the organization.
Venezuela will not participate in any activity or events aiming to justify the interventionism of these countries that want to hurt Venezuela's peace and stability.
A political and economic crisis that for now has no end in sight. Teresa Bo, Aljazeera, Cúcuta.
U.S. President Donald Trump is giving his military chiefs greater flexibility to decide how many troops can be deployed to Iraq and Syria. The move will give the Defense Secretary authority to send more soldiers into Syria to assist with the fight against ISIL and Raqqa. U.S. troops are also backing Iraqi forces in the battle against the armed group in the city of Mosul. And President Trump has told the leaders of Mexico and Canada that he will not pull out of the North American Free Trade Agreement. That's despite the fact that he continuously blames NAFTA for U.S. job losses and campaigned against it. The Indian Army says 3 soldiers and 2 suspected rebels have been killed in Indian-administered Kashmir after fighters stormed a military camp. Earlier on Wednesday, the regional government blocked 22 social media sites for those living in Kashmir Valley. It included Facebook, WhatsApp, and Twitter. The government says it's to maintain public order. Videos and images have appeared online of alleged rights abuses by security forces. British Prime Minister Theresa May has held what she describes as a useful working dinner with the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. The exact agenda of the Downing Street talks, that's not clear, but May's office says she reiterated the UK's desire to keep a special relationship with the EU after Brexit. Barnaby Phillips has more from Westminster.
This was the first meeting between top British and European officials since Theresa May's surprise decision to call a general election on June the 8th. Remember, she says, in order to strengthen her hand in the Brexit negotiations. So the Europeans will have been keen to sound out her thinking on that. They would also have been talking about some of the contentious issues which will come up in the negotiations proper. The so-called Brexit divorce bill. Some European officials have been saying that Britain will have to pay as much as $65 billion as it leaves the European Union. That figure is very controversial, as you can imagine, here in London. They would also have been talking about the fate of millions of European nationals living here in Britain and roughly 1 million or so British people living in the EU. What will happen to them, their rights and so on after Brexit. After this meeting in London, the Europeans will be reporting back to the European Union Council, which is holding a special summit meeting over the weekend in order to formulate its Brexit position.
NASA's Cassini spacecraft has begun its first dive between Saturn and its rings, a place no probe has ever been before. We won't know until later if Cassini will be able to send back any pictures from the mission, which will be its last. Neve Barker reports.
In space for almost 20 years and in Saturn's orbit since 2004, Cassini is one of the most productive and successful planetary missions ever. Despite being more than 1 billion kilometers from Earth, it's provided unprecedented images and data of the planet and its moons, even revealing the existence of ice volcanoes and liquid oceans on the moon Titan.
The meticulous melding together of 12 disparate scientific investigations into a cohesive whole that has essentially rewritten the books on Saturn.
Now, though, with the spacecraft running critically low on propellant, it's been put on a final destructive course. Traveling at more than 110,000 kilometers an hour, Cassini will fly where no spacecraft has flown before, between the rings of Saturn and the planet's atmosphere. It will hopefully give scientists an unprecedented chance to observe the planet and its atmosphere, including the giant hexagonal storm at its north pole.
Perhaps getting close with Cassini, we can answer the question, what keeps the hexagon there in this particular shape? We'll get to see the clouds up close, maybe little tiny storms, little vortices whirling around. Some of the best images ever of the planet itself.
Saturn's rings are mainly made out of water, but there's a risk Cassini could collide with debris during the dive. It will take almost 24 hours before NASA receives confirmation it has survived. Then, over the next 5 months, it's hoped Cassini can repeat the feat another 21 times before the craft is finally destroyed when it enters Saturn's atmosphere in September. The mission has provided some answers, but its discoveries have also generated new questions, including the possibility of life on Titan.
Maybe Titan holds us in question about how we view life as being DNA-based. Perhaps it's based on a completely different system, and Titan might be able to give us that hint or that view into an environment that's so different but still could support fascinating types of life.
There are plans to launch another mission to Saturn with particular focus on Titan. But it will be years before any new craft could be in orbit around the second largest planet in our solar system. Until then, the final months of the Cassini mission are the best chance of learning more. Neve Barker, Al Jazeera.
The director of the films Silence of the Lambs in Philadelphia, Jonathan Demme, has died. The 73-year-old was suffering from throat cancer. The Oscar-winning publicist says he passed away in his apartment in Manhattan. Let's take a look at the headlines right now on Al Jazeera. There has been a huge explosion near Damascus International Airport in Syria. Syrian state TV says it was an Israeli airstrike. Israel's government has not confirmed that. More on this from Imtiaz Tayyab in the Lebanese capital, Beirut.
We have been hearing from intelligence sources that this site that was targeted was also a weapons cache from Iran, which we understand may have been destined for Hezbollah fighters. Now, Hezbollah, of course, very rarely comments publicly on the fighting in Syria, certainly not when it comes to any kind of confrontation that they have with Israel. And it is Israel that we're hearing is behind this airstrike.
Also in Syria, activists say at least 10 people have been killed by a government airstrike at a makeshift refugee camp. 35 others are injured in Idlib province. The Marada camp houses families who'd fled from Aleppo and surrounding areas. There has been more fighting between Turkish forces and Kurdish fighters along Syria's northeastern border. On Wednesday, Turkish jets targeted U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters in both Iraq and Syria. Turkey considers the People's Protection Unit, or YPG, a terrorist group for its alleged links with the separatist Kurdistan Workers' Party. The Trump administration has briefed all U.S. senators on its strategy for getting North Korea to dismantle its nuclear bomb program. The White House has signaled that it's willing to try all non-military options. Police in Hong Kong have arrested 9 pro-independence protesters who took part in a rally last November which condemned Chinese government interference. The detentions follow the arrest of 2 pro-independence legislators on Wednesday. Yao Wai-ching and Baguio Long were charged with illegal assembly for trying to force their way into parliament in November. Venezuela has confirmed it will withdraw from the Organization of American States, accusing it of trying to topple President Nicolas Maduro. Those are the headlines. News continues in Al Jazeera after Rewind. Keep it here.